And Ukraine says that at least 18 people have been killed and dozens more injured in an extended Russian missile and drone attack on Kyiv. The overnight barrage lasted for 11 hours and forced tens of thousands of residents to seek shelter. The mayor says that every district in the capital suffered damage. Russia's defense ministry says the attack was in response to Ukrainian strikes on its civilian infrastructure.
The aftermath of one of the largest attacks on Kyiv since the start of the war. Firefighters worked into the morning to put out dozens of blazes after Russia bombarded the capital overnight. Rescuers raced to locate potential survivors, pulling some from the rubble. But others were still believed to be buried beneath debris.
It was unimaginable. The sound was so terrifying that we thought our building had been hit. You fear that everything is about to collapse on top of you and you'll be trapped under the rubble. It was terrifying, absolutely terrifying.
Ukraine's Air Force said the Russian attack on Kyiv and other cities included dozens of missiles and nearly 500 drones. The bombardment forced tens of thousands to seek shelter in Kyiv's subway system.
I used to go to the shelter often, but now less so. After the latest attacks, though, I decided to go because there were just too many strikes on civilian sites.
Authorities had warned Kyiv residents to prepare for an attack, with Ukraine recently stepping up its own strikes on Russian energy supplies. Those attacks have caused considerable damage in occupied Crimea and deep inside Russia. This Ukrainian strike hit an oil refinery in Moscow 2 weeks ago. Vladimir Putin has admitted the strikes have created problems, leading to widespread fuel shortages.
And DW's Nick Connolly is standing by now for us in Kyiv. Nick, you were at a bomb site this morning. What struck you the most about the scale and the precision of last night's attack?
Well, certainly, I think the most kind of depressing conclusion for people here in Kyiv is that this time around, a lot fewer of those Russian ballistic missiles were shot down than is the normal situation. Even a couple of weeks ago, we had at least over 50% of those missiles intercepted. Last night, it seems like less than 20%, maybe kind of 15% of those missiles were intercepted. That is a serious problem. And that is because Ukraine is totally dependent, as is Europe, on the US for those Patriot interceptor missiles, which are de facto the only game in town for now in terms of intercepting Russian ballistic missiles. For cruise missiles, there are lots of other options, and the vast majority of those are intercepted upwards of 80–90% most of the time. But ballistic missiles, there is only one system, and that is a huge problem. So we don't know whether Ukraine has actually just run out of those missiles or if they had to just keep some back for future attacks. But that is a very vulnerable feeling here in Kyiv, and certainly hearing those missiles coming in with no attendant noise of interception going on is something people here just aren't used to. We were on the left bank in Kyiv in a kind of fairly normal residential district where people basically have just had to get used to this because this is happening to them every couple of months. People telling us that they'd had their windows knocked out several times and were questioning whether it's really worth putting in new glass or just, you know, boarding it up with some kind of provisional wood structures or maybe some plastic, because they can't just afford to do this every couple of months. We had a real sense that the numbers are still rising, because when we arrived there was talk of just one casualty, but lots of people telling us about different neighbours who they believe to be dead. The casualty figures in total now risen to 21, and still lots of people are unaccounted for. And I think the really scary thing, if you are in one of these attacks, is with a ballistic missile, if it's coming your way, you basically don't hear it until it is about to hit. This is not something that you get much warning for. You don't have time to even get into a bathroom away from windows. This is very fast, and these are very big rockets, so obviously the attendant damage is vast. The one residential block we were at, basically an entire staircase had just been knocked off, and so you just had this kind of extraordinary kind of cliff face with lots of tiny specks, which were people, these were people from the fire brigade and from the emergency services kind of digging through the rubble trying to find people still under there.
And Nick, what's the latest on Ukraine's attempts to restock those Patriot missiles?
Well, certainly there's constant diplomacy and constant attempts to, on the one hand, get European countries to hand over the Patriot intercepted missiles that they have for themselves, and that's obviously getting more difficult as those stocks dwindle. Then there's also obviously attempts to get European countries to talk to the US administration and try and get them to prioritize Ukraine, because obviously the Gulf is going to be buying huge numbers of those interceptors, having run through a lot of their stocks in recent months. Obviously Taiwan also top up near the top of that waiting list. And there's obviously incredibly active attempts to try and find a kind of homemade solution. There is talk of a Ukrainian anti-ballistic missile, interceptor missile, also collaboration with European countries, but so far we haven't seen them in action. There was one hope earlier in this war, the European SAMP-T system, that's French-Italian produced, but it seems like, used in real life conditions, it's not actually able to do the job yet. There's talk that that might still be improved upon and that it might be able to kind of take this on. But I think the main takeaway is that Ukraine is now trying to attack Russia's production of ballistic missiles, because it's just not feasible financially or logistically to actually stop these missiles before they fall on people's heads here in Kyiv. It's much more realistic and more likely to work out to actually just methodically take out Russia's production facilities for chips, for navigation systems that make these missiles, fly this way.
A big change in the strategy there. Nick, I'd like to switch gears a little bit and ask you about German prosecutors bringing charges against a Ukrainian national for alleged involvement in the Nord Stream gas pipeline explosions back in 2022. Why have Ukraine's top politicians been so silent on this? I mean, it's a huge accusation on the part of the Germans.
I think there is no political interest here in Kyiv, and we haven't seen a lot in Berlin either, right? At least from the governing parties in talking about this. If they are, forced into a comment, people here just say, well, that's, the independent judiciary in Germany doing its job off record. Obviously, you'll get a lot of people being quite angry that this person, faces significant jail time, judicial consequences for this act. At the same time as the EU, right, talks constantly about reducing dependence on Russian energy. Obviously, that destruction of the pipeline did quite a lot to achieve European kind of reduction in dependence on Russia. But I think there's no upside. There's no win here for Ukraine to talk about this publicly. So I think they're just going to basically, keep away as far as possibly possible and hope that somehow this kind of just washes over and this thing kind of drops out of the top headlines.
I mean, but given that the German prosecutors have also alleged, that this was an action which came directly from the state, that this individual who has been charged was acting, essentially on state orders, Kyiv must see the risk that this Nord Stream verdict could potentially complicate its relationship with Berlin.
Well, certainly in terms of the kind of political debate inside Germany, right? That's something that Roman was talking about just now, also about other parties like the AfD that are a lot more hawkish on this, kind of trying to keep this in the centre of national attention in Germany. I think for now there's a sense, maybe it's misplaced here in Kyiv, that Friedrich Merz's government isn't particularly keen to kind of make this bigger and isn't going to jump on this or change the way it supports Ukraine. So I think the kind of priority for now seems to be just to kind of keep away and hope somehow miraculously some other story comes along and attention wanes.
Nick Connolly with the latest from Kyiv. Thank you, Nick.